Welcome to this week's 2 Men in the Middle. I'm Craig Huey.
I'm Brandon Koenig.
And I'm Jason Peterson.
Brandon, we did a podcast Monday, and it was just a normal podcast. We talked about policy. We talked a little bit about Trump. We talked a little bit about the Georgia elections. And we were talking about a world we knew, something we felt comfortable with. Things were as we've always known them to be on Monday. We're sitting here on Friday afternoon, and in some ways it feels like a major section of the world has changed. And we wanted you to kind of start off with, you have worked in that building. You worked for Senator Jerry Moran. You have been in that building in an official capacity. Tell us a little bit about that building, your experience with that building, and then just what was your reaction to Wednesday sitting there watching that building be overrun?
Right. So I've worked in that building in two different capacities. One was back in 2006 when I lived on the Hill and I was interning for the Senate at that time for Senator Brownback. And I worked there day in and day out. And then the second time was in 2011 as a staffer for Senator Moran when I was based here in Kansas, but traveled to D.C. frequently and worked out of his offices there on the Hill. And what struck me most about working at the Capitol is that I would refer to it constantly to others as it's the citadel of democracy. It is really the hallmark of what we are as a country and who we are as a people. The symbolism is immense. There's no other representation in America that speaks volumes about who we are as a people, our Constitution, our form of government, representative democracy, and the way that those of us who lived in D.C. and worked in the Capitol spoke of it was almost with a very reverential grace and almost a note of sacredness because of what it meant and who had come before us in the Capitol. And it never got old. I would say that every day I was there, I would take time to look at the portraits around me, to go down to the crypt where, which was going to be the burial place for George Washington. I also gave tours when I was an intern, so I knew every inch of the Capitol building, the hallways underground where there were rats that would scurry all the way to the dome where you could take people all the way to the very top. So I knew it inside and out. I know the history of the building. There is nothing like it. So what it means cannot be understated. And what immediately came to mind, too, when all of this occurred on Wednesday, I thought back to 9/11. When the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania was headed for the Capitol building. And those Americans, those heroes on board, when they found that out, they stopped it and they gave up their lives to protect that symbol of democracy and who we are as Americans. So all of that in mind, it was beyond difficult to watch the events unfold on Wednesday. I could not focus on anything else. I was very unproductive as far as work-wise in the rest of my day because I had never seen anything like that. I mean, the last time the Capitol was attacked was in the War of 1812 by the British. We've never had the Capitol attacked in that manner domestically in terms of an insurrection. And it's sad. And it's not only just sad, it's also embarrassing. Because here we are on the world stage and everybody's watching this happen. And we are the leading voice of democracy for the world. We are the voice that tells other countries how to conduct elections, how to function, how to enact peaceful transfers of power and transitions of power. And here we're crumbling and we're not able to do a peaceful transition of power. And I saw the remarks that came in from around the world and from our friends and allies and global leaders. And I'm like, what a position we're in where, they're sending letters of condolences to us. And we are normally the power that is doing the opposite. We're setting the example. And here we're just falling apart before the eyes of the world.
Brandon, tell me about the Capitol Police, because from what I saw on TV, I think I'm like most people. I'm aware that the Capitol has its own police force, but that's all I know. And looking at it yesterday, it seemed more like mall security than a fully functioning police force whose charge is to defend the cradle of our democracy. So, can you talk to people? And me too. They're an actual police force, right? These are highly trained ex-military.
Yes.
This is not what you saw yesterday.
And this isn't like a run-of-the-mill municipal police force, that's hired, officers hired off the streets. It's a very difficult process to become Capitol Police and to become part of that force. And Washington, D.C. is a strange place. The District of Columbia, because it's the nation's capital, but it's also a city, there's a lot of overlap in police presence. There's the D.C. Metropolitan Police, which is for the entire city. You have the Capitol Police. You have the Secret Service that operate in the Capitol. You have the FBI. You have institutions like the Bureau of Prisons that have their own police force, and the U.S. Postal Service. There's several agencies, federal agencies, that have their own police forces. So you have so many. I don't think there's any other city maybe in the world that has as much police presence as DC, with just all of the overlap. So you have that as
these aren't like, I grew up in a small town in Illinois. This isn't the Troy, Illinois police force. These are folks, again, that are trained. It is an elite unit. They have a specific charge to protect the Capitol. I want to make sure people know one of the things what's so bizarre about the Capitol Police is this is an elite police force that just completely failed.
Utterly failed. And so what I don't understand is, at one time, the Capitol Police itself used to be much smaller. So their numbers were increased from the hundreds to the thousands after 9/11. And so they've remained at that level and that size. Now, what I've heard most recently is that many of their members were out due to COVID. So they were COVID stricken. So they were smaller than you would expect. But typically what you see in major events that require heightened security, like the State of the Union, like inauguration, Capitol Police are supplemented by other police forces and agencies throughout DC. And DC has, like I said, there's like 27 different police agencies that operate within the confines of the District of Columbia. So it's relatively easy to be able to bring in additional support if you need it. And to have them assist. That did not happen here. And it's astonishing that you knew that this was going to happen. All the rhetoric was out there. We knew that these massive protests were going to happen. There was the talk of unruliness and unrest possibly happening. And yet there was no additional police presence, to aid in maintaining control. That just wasn't there. If you remember back during the protests during the summer, in the wake of George Floyd's death, Bill Barr upped the police presence for all of the national monuments and the Capitol. In fact, you had the Bureau of Prisons police force, you had the U.S. Postal Service police force, you had all of these additional agencies that were activated and were protecting those memorials and places. And we were stripped down to practically nothing Wednesday. And that's what I don't understand.
And with the Capitol Police Force too, I just want to hear you kind of make this point too. You have dealt with them in their professional capacity at work. They are serious people and they take their job serious. The wandering around the Capitol, that is not in any way permitted under any circumstance. Even you who worked for a senator, did you have an experience where you tried to maybe be somewhere or get somewhere, or you didn't have your badge with you? I mean, I want to set the stage for folks that I just got through watching like 9 videos on Twitter of the Capitol Police opening the door to let the crowd in. I just want to make sure we kind of establish that that's not who these people are. That's not typically what they do. We can talk about why that happened, but tell us a little about what they do and how they function on a day-to-day basis.
So the Capitol Police, there are multiple security checkpoints to get into the Capitol, first of all. And part of the configuration and bringing visitors into the Capitol changed after 9/11. So initially there was one large checkpoint, and now there are a series of checkpoints. So as a visitor, the first checkpoint is to get inside to what they call the Capitol Visitor Center, in which you basically get badges, ID'd. They check your information. And then there's another checkpoint to get into the rest of the Capitol, really the part of the building where people mill about, business is done. And that's another checkpoint you have to go in. And these are security parameters that are set up similar to what you would see at airports, but even more security in terms of having to walk through to be checked, be wanded. You have to state your business there, who you're there. If you're a visitor and you have an office tour scheduled with a member of Congress, you have to state that. You have to prove it. I mean, it's not just something where you can walk in, even through a security parameter. It's very specific. And like you said, they don't play around. When I was working there as an intern, in fact, they've actually been criticized at some points for going too overboard, because there's been members of Congress who have been accosted by Capitol Hill police and questioned because they didn't recognize them initially, and ask them what their business was and why they're there, because they will take great precaution. When I was working at the Capitol on a rainy day, I remember one time I came in and I had this big, bulky black umbrella that was relatively big. And immediately before I could put it on the conveyor belt, a Capitol Hill officer, yelled at me saying, "What is that?" And he's like, "That can't go through the belt. We have to take a look at it." They didn't realize it was an umbrella. Now I told them it was an umbrella, but they still took it. They dusted it, and then handed it back to me a couple minutes later. They don't mess around. I mean, that's what I experienced. And then you saw these people that were walking in with spears, with zip ties, with clubs, in some cases guns. I mean, all kinds of paraphernalia, handcuffs. And they, like you said, they just opened the doors and these people walked right in.
In 12 years ago, like a lot of families, we took a trip, a family vacation to New York, and we went to DC, and we huddled the kids up. My kids were probably 12 and 10 or 10 and 8 or something. And we huddled the kids up and said, there will be no jackass behavior inside of this building. There will be repercussions. They will be serious. You are to be quiet. You are not to touch anything. You are to treat this with the respect that is meant to be, that it deserves. And that was heartbreaking watching that. Like you said, some jackass in a horned helmet and a spear. And it's still even hard to articulate how disgusting that was. And Jason, we spent all day Wednesday kind of rage texting at each other with just can't believe what's happening, can't understand what's going on. What's maybe a way to start talking about what actually happened is, now that we're a couple of days removed from this and emotions have died down a little bit, what are the things that you just can't get out of your head, that you just cannot believe that this actually happened on Wednesday?
I have a little image on repeat in my head. So I've been there as well. It's about 15 years ago. I went as a volunteer, met with Congressman Yoder at the time to work on a foreign aid thing, and I couldn't get past the majesty of the building, the impressiveness. It was almost a bit intimidating, but it felt serious and real, and you felt like you were in a place that was influential and had integrity. And it was an amazing experience, one that I won't forget. And I also remember there being real security and being escorted and going through, scanners and all that kind of thing. And so one of the images that I saw on the news that's stuck in my head that I recall, the other end of it, was this man throwing a 2x4 through a window and breaking the glass. And having been on the inside, which I think was the same spot looking out, I just don't understand what kind of personality goes up and throws a 2x4 through a window through this building that, not whether you're upset with the government or not, it represents the core of being an American and our history, and so much that goes into what is ultimately a foundation for our freedoms. And just such a massive lack of respect. And I understand that people are super angry and think that they were disenfranchised and the election was stolen and everything. But I still can't connect the reaction that I saw on TV and the way people behaved with how they felt. And
let's keep the conversation focused on the people we saw. Let's first we'll get to Trump and that, but first let's talk about that actual crowd.
The war paint and the furs and the horns. And I mean,
and did you notice that many of them were wearing QAnon shirts and apparel? And so that's part of this.
Or the waving the Confederate flag inside.
Yes.
I mean, just the image of that still
that's
just,
never been done.
I want to scream.
Jarring.
The guy who showed up in his Auschwitz hoodie, another classic guy.
Yeah, these are patriots. These are real patriotic Americans.
The two words that I wrote down is ignorant and arrogant. The sheer ignorance to not understand where you are, what that building represents, and the arrogance. What I found so galling is people who have just participated in an insurrection and breached the Capitol building took it as if they were on a tour. They were casually walking around. They were taking selfies of each other. The gentleman was arrested today who broke into Pelosi's office and put his feet on her desk. Just that whole kind of idea of having no historical context of where you're at and thinking that it's okay, or you're proving some point by doing this. To what you just said, Jason, I just don't know. I didn't think in America that personality existed.
And Craig, you wouldn't do that going across the street into the Sprint building to somebody's office if you were pissed off as them as a carrier. I mean, so there's something fundamentally wrong with the personality type who's like, I'm going to just roll into Pelosi's office and throw my feet up in the desk, and or McConnell's or anybody's. It doesn't matter what side they're on. It's just a profound lack of disrespect.
And it's not only disrespectful. I mean, more was done than that. In addition to the breaking of glass to get in, let's not forget that there were laptops and computers that were stolen and taken. The outside sign for Nancy Pelosi's office was torn off and broken into pieces, and the protesters held them up and posed in photos. They also took the speaker's podium, and carted that off.
He got arrested today.
Oh, did he? Oh, good. So clearly there was an element of these people too. So you can't separate the political from what happened, because a lot of it was clearly directed at Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. But you also, had instances where people were defecating in the Capitol, and then they were wiping their excrement on the walls. That had to be cleaned up. And I tell you, if you have a moment, find the photos. There are cleaners that work at the Capitol, most of whom are African American, and they had to clean all that up. And so that's also another striking image. And you have these African American workers cleaning up, in some cases, the vile, disgusting stuff left behind by these protesters who were not only arrogant, and I think just didn't care, but they felt entitled to do this. Several of them said, this is the people's house, we can do it. It's us, we're taxpayers. There was a sense of entitlement that they didn't have to be held to account. And there's also a alternate reality here. PBS was interviewing some of them, and when they were taken to task on their disruption and their acts of violence, they would immediately respond and say, "Oh no, this isn't violent. This is peaceful. We're being peaceful."
Well, for that crowd, there's a couple of facts that came out today. Number one, for the gentleman who was the Capitol Police officer who unfortunately was killed, he was beaten to death with a fire extinguisher. Up to 60 Capitol Police officers have been hospitalized with injuries during this insurrection. Most of their injuries were caused by getting beaten with pipes that people brought with them. This was not just a casually walk in and look around the Capitol. This was a violent insurrection by people who I believe were looking for Mike Pence and were looking for people, senators, congressmen within the Capitol. To do what with? Thank God, we'll never know. But when you have people walking around with zip ties, ropes, handcuffs, lead pipes, let's not forget, too, they also gained access to the building when they used some sort of chemical agents on the Capitol Police to overcome them as well. So Yes, there is an element of this that says, hey, this was the bad apple section of the MAGA crowd. This is this 0.5% of MAGA folks that are willing to get violent and willing to take those steps. But for the majority of the MAGA movement, it has been peaceful. And there are some grains of truth to that. But I guess what I'm struggling with is, how do you look at the entire MAGA movement? Or first, let's separate the MAGA movement from conservatives. How do you look at the entire MAGA movement now, knowing that these elements exist within it? And not only that these elements exist, they will become active in the right circumstance.
Well, and this isn't going away, right? And I think we also left out, there were pipe bombs that were planted around the Capitol and the RNC and DNC offices. There was 2 instances of a noose that were put up. The intentions were clear what they were trying to do and the planning that went on for this. In fact, the organizers were selling sweatshirts that said Civil War, January 6, 2021. And many of the protesters were wearing those sweatshirts. So this was not organic. This is not just a few bad apples making a couple of bad choices. Like, this was planned. And if you read the message boards and you go on Parler, all of this talk was out there. And it hasn't gone away. There are screenshots of similar messages on Parler talking about attempts to do this again on Inauguration Day. And so even with Trump out of the picture, the problem is that a match has been lit. You have groups like QAnon, the Proud Boys, these other groups that operate on Parler, on these channels, that incite and are mobilizing these people to fly from all over the country and to take part in this. And so I don't know what the answer is. And part of the reason why I think this is almost like a Pandora's box, like it's been opened, and I don't know how you put the lid back on and stop this, because this has been building. And as you have said, and we have all said for so long, like, the signs were there. Like, so many of us have been warning against this, saying this is only going to get worse. Something terrible is going to happen. People are going to die, because we saw where this was headed. And it just kept building and building. And there was nobody who was willing to stand up and say enough is enough. Like, this is not going to be allowed. And, and now, it's great to see members of Congress and other leaders stand up now, but it's after the fact. It's too late.
So, Jason, one of the hard questions we're trying to answer here, and this is something that my wife and I have been arguing about for 3 days, and we're both huge libs, and we can't even come to an agreement on this. The Black Lives Matter protests of the summer. The counter narrative on the conservative side of the House is that, wait a minute, liberals, you seem to be just fine when for an entire summer people burnt buildings, burnt churches, destroyed property. I'm not saying that excuses what happened on Wednesday, but we seem to have a double standard when it comes to protesting. Is there anything to that? And if there is something to that, should we even care?
Some of it's scale. The Black Lives Matter protests were much larger with much more people. So you are going to get a certain percentage of people who are willing to go further than others. Some of it is, I think, the root idea that the people who breached the Capitol building were doing it during a time of the most democratic thing that can happen in that building at the time, which is counting the electoral votes for the election. And so, deeply trying to influence the democratic foundation of our own government. I can appreciate the view that the reaction is different. I have to go back to the scale, though. Here you're talking about some extremists, right? One night, one location, perfectly timed for this. And the Black Lives Matter protests, which were largely peaceful. There were so many more people involved and so many more locations across that. The scale of the two are very different. And, it's easy to look at the worst behaving person in the Black Lives Matter protest and try to compare them to what happened this, but the size and scope of those are so different. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's what comes into my head first.
I think at some point we all have to agree. We all have the right to protest, and we're encouraging to protest. As soon as the first punch is thrown, first window is broke, or the first thing is lit on fire, you are now participating in a riot. And riots in this country are put down by law enforcement, and people go to jail. Somehow we have to at least agree on the rules of the game moving forward. Please protest. Please make your voice be heard. But the second one act of violence happened, we're not going to do the mostly peaceful thing anymore. Once one thing goes, it all goes.
Well, and I think it's important to mention then too, a lot of what caused us to be upset during the Black Lives Matter protests is there were plenty of cases where there were completely peaceful people literally standing there who were attacked, right? So we've got to kind of carve out that, as in there was very well-intentioned peaceful protests, people who, at the worst, I think there was some video from a couple of those times where people were downtown in the plaza, and you'd hear, 4-letter words slung or whatever. But
Jason,
that's not the cause to go get
agree with you
sprayed.
here. People were murdered and people died during the BLM protest. I mean, there was a sheriff in St.
Are you talking about the whole breadth of them, though? That's what I'm referring to.
Okay.
There are cases where there were very peaceful protests that nobody got hurt at all. And, there was enough tension involved that the police got involved earlier than they should have.
And those are hard needles to thread. Because you're right. How do you separate a peaceful protest during the day and a group of people who burn something down at night?
Yeah.
And that's where I hate to add one more thing in this country that we need to correct, but it certainly feels like we've got to get our protest game together, because neither side understands, I think, exactly what to do in a protest.
I don't think you'll ever have rules for that, though, right? It's basically the expression of raw emotion.
Something I wrote down is in 1992, Clinton is famous for having what's called the Sister Souljah moment. Sister Souljah was a nondescript rapper in the 90s who Clinton used in a political speech to the Rainbow Coalition. Rainbow Coalition is a political group put together by Jesse Jackson, predominantly black. In this speech, he basically confronted rap lyrics and cultural issues in the black community. So the Wikipedia explanation or definition of a Sister Souljah moment is when a politician makes a public repudiation of somebody in his own party or his own constituency. Who is going to Sister Souljah moment the people that broke into the White House, the people who broke into the Capitol, the people that went to that rally, honestly believing that Pence was going to overturn the election, and the MAGA movement more in general? Who has the ability, or how would that happen? Who can speak plainly, truthfully, honestly, impactfully to that group?
There aren't a lot of people on the with moral authority on that side right now. I mean, the best case scenario from this week is maybe Mitt Romney or something, and he's not respected enough by everybody in that group to listen to him.
There are a handful of Republicans who have sounded the alarm since the beginning. They're small, but they're there. But the problem is these aren't the people that would be listened to. And to give you an example, Lindsey Graham has been Donald Trump's lapdog for the last 4 years. But if you saw the video where he was basically almost run out of Reagan National earlier today by Trump supporters because he was not 100% loyal, they started calling him traitor and yelling at him and yelling profanities. So the problem is these people won't listen to anybody because anybody who's not 100% loyal gets discarded immediately. So who is left? And the only thing that I can think of is that these people consume news from places like Fox News and OAN and Newsmax and Parler. You would have to have leading voices in those outlets and channels that would level set with them. And I don't know that any will.
Those people aren't reading the Post, who seems to have come around this week.
I think we're kind of in agreement that right now, really nothing can be said or done to the MAGA movement. We're just too close to Trump's presidency. We're going to have to, some time is going to have to be put between what happened yesterday and Trump leaving office on the 20th before somebody emerges with this. It seems like the first attempts to talk to these people were by Hawley and Cruz, and they were completely manipulating them for political purposes. Hawley and Cruz have been just absolutely waylaid for this. Hawley, the KC Star, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, he is just being crucified. Is there anything that can be done and should be done to Cruz and Hawley? Brandon, do you see, I mean, there's recall efforts in the local states. Those are very difficult. Both of these are red states. I would put the odds of Cruz being reelected at about 96%. I'd put it at Hawley at about 90%. Do you see them paying any type of political price for their part in what happened Wednesday?
Well, in terms of being removed from office, expelled from Senate, or rejected by the voters, no, I don't think either of those are going to happen. I think there's more of a opportunity with Cruz, because you have to remember Cruz only won by 3 points in his last reelection, and Texas is changing demographically, and Cruz is so disliked. I think there is a possibility he could lose the next time he's up. So Hawley less so. But I think that the best we can hope for is, number one, there isn't the willpower for their colleagues to expel them. And that is quite a process in and of itself. But they could be censored by their colleagues on the Senate floor. And at least that would be a strong rebuke, because it's rarely done. It's only been done like a dozen times in our history against sitting members of Congress. So I say do it. And then number two, each of these senators, I'm actually Hawley. I'm thinking of Hawley and then Marshall in Kansas. The unique thing here about Kansas and Missouri is that each of them come from states where there was a split. The other senator from each state voted to certify the election. So if you're a business organization or a trade association and you want a senator to speak to your members, don't invite Hawley and don't invite Marshall. I think that these senators should be isolated and marginalized as much as possible. They should be denied committeeships. I think you make them as powerless as possible. That's really the realistic way that you're going to make them responsible and accountable.
Do you think either one of them shows up on stage in 2024 trying to run for president now?
100%.
Yeah, I think they're still both. I mean, there's been no change of heart by either of them. I mean, their capital was attacked, and they continued with this charade. And despite some of their colleagues being very strong vocally, I mean, Mitt Romney, basically attacked them in all but name, and shouted at Cruz as the Capitol was being evacuated. But it didn't daunt them. They don't care. I mean, their political fortunes come first. And Hawley has shown that.
The only thing Hawley and Cruz are mad about that what happened on Wednesday is the insurrection cut down on their TV time. That's it. That's the only thing they're pissed about. They staged this completely as a launching point for 2024. And the only thing they're upset about is their camera time got interrupted. That's all. They kept right back at it, right? I mean, Hawley ejected again to Pennsylvania just to, put the cherry on top of being the biggest asshole in the world. I mean, what?
And the biggest slap in the face was on the day and during the hours that this was all taking place and this insurrection was happening. Hawley was sending out email appeals. He was fundraising.
They don't. This is why we couldn't do this podcast Wednesday, because I would be just screaming the F word right now. But there's absolutely no evidence that Hawley or Cruz feel any remorse, have learned anything from this. And I think both of them, if you asked, probably would almost tell you this may have helped them running for 2024. Because who are we all talking about? I mean, who is gaining the spotlight?
If these guys were to be successful, they would have to have more appeal than Trump. And coming out of this, everybody's seen their true colors. They know who they are. They might be able to still whip up the extremist base, but I don't see them getting anywhere near a majority of the Republican Party support in the future.
The rumor was that Mitt Romney basically was screaming in Ted Cruz's face when they were on lockdown, that he backed him into a corner and was screaming at him, "Are you happy with yourself? Is this what you wanted? Do you finally, have you had enough?" That he finally hit his breaking point. Jason, how do Cruz and Hawley, how can they be in the same Republican Party as Mitt Romney? And I'll throw Ben Sasse in there too. How do they reconcile that?
I think we've seen the end of the party as we know it. There's no way they can remain in the same party, and I really don't think at this point there's a way that voters can see it the same way going forward. By the way, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think that's the point. How can a voter distinguish a Republican if my choice is, if you throw all four of those into the Republican pot, how is a voter supposed to well, these two aren't the same thing. This is an apple and an orange.
If there were ever a time for a new party to rise out of the ash of some terrible event like this, it's got to be now.
There isn't any long-term survival. And I will tell you, as somebody who's watching and commenting online on Facebook and Twitter on party pages like the Kansas Republican Party and others, that split is already apparent. There are Trump supporters who are deeply enraged at the fact that the party issued condemnations of the violence that took place. And there are people that are already saying, we're going to form our own party. We were only here because of Trump, and we're no longer going to be Republican.
Something I just thought of what you guys were talking about, the Capitol Police, that I thought was worth throwing in here is, for all the terrible mistakes and lack of preparation the Capitol Police had, thank God the SWAT team that evacuated the congressional and Senate members and Pence were so effective at their job, because if they were still in there, this conversation would be even worse.
Well, the carnage would have been much worse. We are very fortunate that, there was only 5 deaths. I mean, we could have easily seen dozens and dozens of deaths, and we could be talking about, succession with members of Congress, and what to do. I mean, the intent was clear, and it can't be understated that these people came armed and ready, and, their targets were not there when they arrived, thankfully.
And thank God for the 3 women who grabbed the official statements from the electors from the states. They were in those 3 kind of leather-looking cases-looking things, and they had enough presence about them when they were being evacuated to grab those. Think if that group would have broken in and found the electors, the actual physical documents that they were reading to say Pennsylvania's 20 electors go to, and destroyed those. It's just, I think your point's a good one in that while it was horrific and lots of damage was done, we came within an eyelash of this being really, really, really bad.
I'm just trying to find some kind of optimistic view on the outside of this, and it's so hard.
If you do, please say it out loud, Jason.
How do we use this as a lesson for the 20th? How do we? I sure hope they're redoubling their efforts on planning for security of that event.
Well, at the very least, because more is being, planned by these agitators for the 20th. I mean, they're planning to come back, and it's actually very scary if you look at some of the talk and chatter on Parler and other places for what they're planning then. So, there has to be, and I don't know. There is not a lot of time. You're talking about less than 2 weeks to get this under control. So that's what scares me. That's not much time before Inauguration Day, but they have to. They better be redoubling and putting 24 hours around the clock effort into getting this fixed and having a security plan, because whatever plan they had that was executed here did not work. And I'm not convinced that there was not intentional damage done and intent on the part of the administration, the Justice Department, to not up security as they should have, because it just doesn't pass the smell test.
Would this be the year to do it virtually? We've got a pandemic, and a lot of it's pageantry. You can take the formality of it, do it in a one of the. White
But
House.
there's so much, I think, more than ever, though, don't we need the symbolism of seeing the inauguration on the Capitol steps and seeing at least some people there and having at least some of that pageantry? It's not going to be the same. And we knew it wasn't going to be the same because of the pandemic and because Biden is smart and he was going to scale it down. But there's no substitute for it either. And I think now more than ever, we need it because we need to show that democracy continues and that it hasn't been disrupted.
I need to see Joe Biden at the Capitol saying, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, and we are going to get back to where we were. And I need all of you with me, but we're going to get there. We need a feel-good traditional moment for that inauguration. And my fear is people won't allow that to happen. But I think this year more than any, if it were possible, this is a year we need 3 million people on the lawn. We can't do it because of COVID. That would be irresponsible. And I'm not advocating for that. But we really need some sort of show that lets people know we're functioning, we're here, and we're going to move forward. I wrote down there's kind of 3 narratives that are evolving both politically and culturally out of this incident. And the first one is that anybody who voted for Trump should have known better, should have known this was going to happen. And in some ways, this is your fault. I certainly understand that from the Democrat side of you want to drive that narrative as far as you can. Brandon, is that, again, I almost called you as being the only Republican, but you're not the Republican here anymore. I think I'm actually more Republican than you are at this point. One more week of Fox News and I may switch my party affiliation. But obviously that's not fair. But what do the Republicans do about that perception?
Well, I mean, they have to start with hard truths and acknowledgement that they contributed to this. And I think, the first step to recovery and to healing is announcing that you were a part of this and that you self-reflection and it needs to change. And some of the older statesmen have already done that, people who are no longer in office, but the people that are at the apparatus of power, high-ranking officials within the RNC, elected leaders have to do that. I mean, they really have to assume blame and culpability in this, at least their portion of it, and say this has to change. Probably the remarks that stood out the most to me was Senator John Thune, when he said for the past 4 years, we've been a party built around one person, one personality. He's like, we need to return to being a party of ideas, of being a party of big, bold statements. And it has to start now. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, he said what I think most of us who have been very anti-Trump since the beginning noticed and have pointed out, but the rest of the party refused to acknowledge that it became a personality cult and it was not sustainable. It was going to come to a head, and that's where we're at now.
But
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Even with Trump gone soon, please, we still have foundational problems of this alternate reality here. Whether it's half of Congress, whether it's Fox News or the social media, whatever it is, there is a distribution of truth that differs based off of your vantage point. And as long as that goes on, this continues.
But how do you break that, though? I mean, how do you, if the 3 of us were standing in front of, let's just say for easy math, the 1,000 people that breached the building, and it was our job to bring these people back into the fold. Jason, what's your...
You're not going to do it with one speech or conversation. This is 4 to 12 years of constantly covering conspiracy theories and alternative facts and truthiness, and it's the worst kind of propaganda because it ultimately leads to death and destruction. And until we figure out the avenues that exists and get rid of them, this continues because. You yourself said a couple of episodes ago, and this is, if we're just talking about Fox News now, if you just consume Fox News, the number one story is completely different than the number one story on other networks. None of this goes away until we figure out how information is disclosed differently amongst the populace.
And Jason, with my still immersion into Fox News, you're 100% correct. I have a totally different perspective about this than I would have if I hadn't been watching Fox for the last 3 weeks.
I don't want to just target Fox. I mean, it's a good example because you're on there, right? But clearly there's even darker ways to consume this information. And
Newsmax, OAN. And let's not forget, a lot of the viewers of Fox News are migrating to these other platforms because Fox News is now not seen as loyal enough. And, and so it's going to become more extreme. And the idea of how you combat that, I mean, we have to realize that, again, there's a mental conditioning that has gone on here with many people who have become wrapped up in all of this. And so you're talking about years of deconditioning. And I would compare it to therapy. I mean, you're years and years of therapy to really get out of these mindsets. It's not something that's going to happen overnight.
But we're talking about accountability of our political leaders, accountability of these traditional news stations, and social media. What about accountability of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and these other networks that have allowed this information to go without filter for years and years and years? I don't hear much talk about that. It's like, okay, you banned Trump for 24 hours or for 2 weeks. Great. Now you're off the news and we'll go talk about the Capitol Police again. I mean, 2 weeks from now, it's going to be right back up on those same platforms.
Let me throw this out to you guys and tell me what you think of this. And I'm going to butcher this quote, but Thomas Sowell, who is a black economist, has a phrase or a saying that the path to equality looks a lot like tyranny. And Jason, when you were talking about big tech and what their role has been in this and how do you stop people from being exposed to this stuff, that kind of phrase popped in my mind because does it take tyranny? Does it take banning Parler? Does it take telling people you can't go to these sites? Do we have to silence something? This is the part that gets real complicated. The only way to correct those people we saw yesterday is to remove them from the sources of information that are feeding them this shit. To do that would be tyrannical. To shut those sources off or to forbid them is exactly what this country was not set up to do. So how do we move forward with re-educating or reorientating some folks to what is actually real and how some of this stuff works without overstepping and becoming tyrannical?
You're right. That's extremely hard to solve for, but there is some precedent here, right? You can't, what's the old example? You can't go into a crowded movie theater and yell fire. Like there are limits to free speech right now. And I don't know how you apply those to social media and these other forms of information distribution, but it seems like there is a path there that overall our culture has agreed to is the right balance, right? It's not in balance right now.
And Josh Hawley's bitching because his book on big tech got yanked by Simon and something, a major publisher. And Josh Hawley has a law degree from Yale, I believe, and a degree from Stanford or something. Josh Hawley is highly educated. He put out a tweet that said this was Orwellian and First Amendment. I can only say this so many times to people. First Amendment only applies to the government. It does not apply to a private business. One of the core principles of our culture is something called free association. If I don't like Jason, I am free not to associate with him. If a business is doing something I don't like, I don't have to buy their stuff. If I own a company that puts out books and suddenly, Brandon, I don't like you or your book, I don't have to publish it. This is
exactly. Hawley knows better, and he knows the First Amendment.
But this is what's so maddening. The tech companies, this is not a First Amendment issue because it's not the government. This is a government intervention in private business issue. They're two totally different things.
Well, most of these big tech forms have policies in place. They're just not enforcing.
They have user policies, code of conduct policies. These are private companies. And so we have reached a point now where people treat them as public entities and think that there should be equal time no matter what the rhetoric is. And people seem to forget that we've always had restrictions on rhetoric that is considered insightful that could lead to violence. I mean, that's always been the case in various channels, prior to the advent of big tech and big social media. So there has to be a level setting of what we're up against, and that these companies do have to take responsibility and take action, because their platforms are the largest, and by far that is where people consume and get their information and make decisions. And people are not only being influenced. I mean, you have minds that are being molded and shaped by what they are consuming, specifically on social media. And in fact, they've done studies about this, that when you consume information on social media versus consuming it from a friend directly or another source on the telephone or via like a magazine or a newspaper or a book, the impact is much more direct and is much more long lasting. And that is something we're still at the initial stages of understanding the impact on the brain. But there's no question that it has a much different impact than we would otherwise get information, and that has to be acknowledged. And so we're at that point. And if this isn't the catalyst, I don't know what is.
Let me ask the question this way: if Twitter, and I don't know every bit of their terms of service, but I can guess, if Twitter from day one enforced their terms of service as they're written each time, every time, would they exist? Now, let's remember that stuff like no stolen material, no material posted that somebody didn't say you could post, videos of illegal activities. The point I'm making is that if Twitter actually enforced their rules of engagement equally, they would not exist because their content would suck and nobody would look at it. Do we all agree on that?
Yeah, and you're describing an extremely difficult computer science problem too. The volume of information that Twitter has to parse to determine if it's good or bad is just extraordinary. But then there's very obvious examples where there is information that violates the policy and they've ignored it because it's somebody who's a cult of personality or whatever.
Or they delay, and there's a long time that passes before they act on it and take it down, which is just as damaging.
So we built these set of rules for Twitter, and we did it with the best intention. And the first thing that happened that we never thought would happen is what you just brought up, Jason, the scale. Suddenly, everybody in the planet is using this. And it's like, well, shit, there's no way we can enforce any of this stuff equally. So we basically say these rules now exist to enforce what we don't like. And I think that's the problem. The big tech companies have to come out and admit that they are driven off content that is in direct violation of what their rules are. And we have to come up with a little bit different rules that can be applied a little bit more evenly across the board. I completely disagree from banning Trump from Twitter. I think he's banned on Facebook, Instagram, and he's back on Twitter. Banning Trump permanently from these platforms, what does that do? I don't understand what the objective is.
It was really nice not hearing his ranting and seeing videos of him, saying he loved the insurrectionists. There's an element here that we need to look inward. Every single one of us who's on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, there's an element of, you can vote with your mouse, your keyboard, right? You don't have to go use those services. And if enough people did that, guess what? They'd start to either enforce their policies or they'd go out of business. Now, we collectively like the drama. We like seeing all the different inputs that are on there, and we subscribe to all these different channels, and we get angry, and we sit on podcasts and we rant about it. But that just feeds it, and it keeps coming, right?
I mean, and that's a good.
I do disagree, Craig, though. Like, I think on Trump specifically, because I think after January 20th, when he becomes private citizen, I say ban him. I mean, no. I mean, hold him accountable. They've given him a pass because he is president, and they have explained this on numerous times, both Twitter and Facebook, that because he's a political leader, that they want to give him a platform because of the importance of what he says. But that's not going to be the case anymore going forward. And he should be held accountable just as they would hold anybody else accountable.
This has been described as like a 10-year setback for the Republican Party. Because Brandon, we've talked about this a lot about branding, and we talked about this a lot in Missouri, where Aiken ran under the Republican brand, and he was such an idiot. It basically allowed Claire McCaskill to win 2 terms. She was a 2-term senator in the Missouri Senate. Missouri, despite Claire McCaskill pulling that trick off, is a very red state. How much damage just across the board to the Republican brand has this one instance done?
Well, and it's difficult. I don't know that it's possible yet to still quantify the damage because, again, the party is in free fall, and I do agree that it's splitting. I mean, this is the beginning of the end of the Republican Party as we have known it. And the problem, too, is that looking ahead, if we look ahead to the 2022 elections and the states that are likely to gain representation due to the census, these are going to be Sunbelt states. They're already moving away from the Republicans. Places like Arizona and Georgia will continue to move further away from the Republican brand. North Carolina as well. Texas is right there, not far behind. So, the Republicans are going to be tarnished and associated with the events of Wednesday for many, many years to come. And so they are going to have to make a decision, even if there is short-term gain to appealing to the remnants of Trump's coalition, that will come at the expense of a general electorate, which is not going to be forgiving based on what happened last Wednesday. And prior to what happened last Wednesday, I think the results in Georgia on Tuesday already showed us the direction and where voters were going and holding the party to account. And that was before the insurrection.
So, and I know Craig probably wants to get to Georgia too, but in some ways, Brandon, isn't the Georgia vote a little bit of a challenge to our assumption that the Republican Party's in free fall? There was still a massive, massive turnout for those 2 Republican senators who went on record at well ahead of time where they stood.
Well, yes, in some ways, and so, but again, you have to also put that in the context of. Georgia hadn't elected a Democrat to the Senate in over 25 years. The last time they had a special where the Republican did come out victorious, it was by well over 500,000 votes. And so Republicans tend to turn out higher in Georgia anyway, but the idea that Democrats would turn out in high numbers is only a recent phenomenon and only recently started back in, going back to the Obama years and then accelerated with in 2016 and then obviously 2020. So with everything that Abrams was able to do and laying that groundwork has really changed the calculus. So yes, Republicans did turn out. I think they turned out 88% of their voters from the November election, but Democrats turned out 93%.
Yeah.
And so
the results speak for themselves there for sure. But I still find it somewhat shocking, which I shouldn't be because we saw it in November too. You still have 49.3% or whatever of the people pulling the lever voting for what I saw as the crazy.
But you do. I agree. You do. But again, if you look at the crosstabs of what the trend lines are, metropolitan Atlanta, I mean, at one point, metropolitan Atlanta was heavily Republican. The Atlanta suburbs were safe Republican, and that's no longer the case. With every election, they are moving decisively away from the Republican brand, and that's where the growth is. So even though there was that 49%, the population growth in the state is in the suburban areas of Atlanta, and that's where you're seeing the greatest trends away from the Republican Party. And so that's where it was 49%, but then in a few years, it's going to be, 47%. It's going to continue to tick down just based on the numbers.
So my wife asked me, go ahead, Jason. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's okay. I want to make one more run at it because I feel like I'm not making my point, which is let's say, Brandon, you're right. Let's say Republicans never win Georgia again. There's still a core fundamental like philosophical difference that's not being addressed, that almost half of the country is not in alignment with. So even if that group never has their representation again, they're forever angry, forever on the outside, forever causing a problem, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and it's a good point. I don't know how you address that. You had nearly 47% of the country overall that voted for Trump, right? I think in any other era of American politics, that wouldn't have happened. Barry Goldwater lost in a landslide to Lyndon Johnson, and I mean, you're talking about well over 20 points that separated them. So how are we at this place in America where, with everything we've experienced, you still have this nearly half, even though it's not a majority, it's still under 50%, still half that are that loyal no matter what. And that gets to the politics of resentment. It gets to the politics of grievance. It gets to the politics of, and I don't have an answer. I don't know how you speak to that.
Yeah, and that's the piece that I was trying to hit. You're right. The political side of it sounds dangerous for the long-term viability of our two-party system, right? Of the way we have this organized. So anyway,
because you're right, Jason. Because I mean, even if Trump goes away, there's other people that can channel it. There are other actors that can come onto the stage who in many ways can be more effective than Trump. I would argue Josh Hawley is one of those. I mean, he has taken on the populist nationalist mantle, and he's much more savvy, much smarter than Trump is. He's not going to make, the type of gaffes and mistakes. And so this is here to stay. But how do we address it? That's a big question.
So Georgia is an anomaly, and we have to look at everything Georgia with a grain of salt. My wife looked at me the other day and said, how in Missouri do we get a Stacey Abrams? And I'm like, that's a great question. And I did a little thinking on that and a little Googling. And did you guys know Georgia is the only state in the United States that has a predominantly black population?
And Mississippi does too, doesn't it?
I don't think so. Georgia is predominantly black. California is a mixture of brown, and everybody else is still white. So Missouri could never have a Stacey Abrams in a Georgia because we do not have a primarily black population. So that's the first one. The second thing with the two Georgia Senate races, you have to throw them completely out for historical context, because no Senate race we've never had this happen before, where two Senate runoffs happened right after a presidential election that the president actively sabotaged every possible chance he got. So if Trump just would have shut up from December 4th to January 5th, the Republicans win those two seats, and they probably win them fairly comfortably. The other thing is Loeffler and Perdue are two of the grossest, weakest candidates the Republicans could have fielded. If Republicans are mad in Georgia about the Senate races, get mad at Brian Kemp, because if he would have appointed Collins to the Loeffler Senate seat, he wins in a landslide. Why he chose Kelly Loeffler, an inexperienced, never elected, what could it be? I don't know, the $800 million she has. But if he would have chose a different elected official in Georgia, steamrolled. So it was almost a comedy of errors in Georgia that led to this, with Stacey Abrams effectively activating a minority population. We don't have that in other states, which makes it very difficult to pull that off. And the reason she could pull it off is African-American voters, for the most part, vote as a monolithic bloc for Democrats. She already had the bloc. She didn't have to build the coalition. She just had to activate it. And when the perception across the country and in Georgia was that she got screwed by Brian Kemp, when the Secretary of State kind of ran his own election, he was in charge of the election that he was running in, that resonated with the African-American population, and she was able to do what she can do. My only point here is that we can't take Stacey Abrams and reproduce that in other states, because Georgia's, as a state, is made up very differently than other states. And
I agree. Although there are aspects of that you can leverage, because I mean, Missouri being an example, I know that much smaller minority population, but part of the problem in Missouri is that even that existing registered voter population in the minority community doesn't get out and vote. The big story was at Jackson County, where the base of Kansas City, Missouri, had lower turnout in 2020 than they had in 2016. And so how is that? And so a lot of people have been scratching their heads. How do you activate? And you can say, well, there was the pandemic. There's a lot of dysfunction within the Democratic Party machinery in Jackson County that probably contributed to it. But there's a lot of it is just these are voters that are untapped and just haven't been activated. And, having somebody like a Stacey Abrams to at least do that in those communities where even if you don't have the majority, just increase it, start to make gains. Because a lot of this, too, is based on perception of movement and strength. And if you're able to make gains cycle to cycle, it puts you in a good place.
But that's what I'm saying. That state had this large African-American population that she could activate. If you're looking to replicate that, I agree with you at the county and smaller levels. You can find pockets where that will work. But you can't take what she did in Georgia and replicate it in Missouri. We just don't have we don't have a minority population that you can activate that way.
I agree, but there are states where you can do that, and Mississippi is another one. And this has been talked about because Mississippi is another state. It may not have a majority, but it's close to it. I think maybe 40% African American, and they don't vote. The voting results. Mississippi has had some Senate races now where Democrats have come within 5 points of defeating a Republican, and that's been talked about. But they don't have a strong Democratic Party get out the vote apparatus. So they're saying that Mississippi needs to at least emulate what's going on in Georgia and start to build that because the possibility is there.
And I think you're the only one here with a political science degree, but how can somebody like Ted Cruz, who is the senator in a state that is rapidly changing into purple, whose demographics, everything is working against him? You just saw two senators in your own party lose an election they never should have lost in Georgia, and you still think this is the way forward. Cruz is a completely political animal who will do anything to increase his political power. He has shown that a dozen times. We don't have to go through what he did with Trump and his vote your conscience at the Republican speech and then immediately turns into Trump's lapdog. But shouldn't Cruz be looking at what happened in Georgia and saying, I'm next? I mean, if I want to stay in the Senate for another 12 years, I'm going to have to beat that because that's coming to Texas.
But he doesn't. He's running for president. He is up in 2024. His Senate seat, he was reelected in 2018. But he is planning on running for president in 2024. If the calculus was on his Senate seat, I think it would be different. But it's not on that. It's on the presidency.
I feel like a lot of what you guys are talking about, too, is political ground game. And that's important. That's influential. But at the end of the day, it's still the candidates, right? If you get a really strong, charismatic, trustworthy candidate that aligns with all of your ideals, you're going to get up and vote for them.
Obama was a poster child of that. Yeah.
Yes. All this, if you're really good at the ground game, great. You got people out because you had to, because you just had a candidate that people weren't that inspired by.
Just some breaking news here. Lisa Murkowski has called on Trump to resign. I don't know if that breaks the floodgates for Republicans in the Senate. I don't know if that changes anything.
I don't know if you heard earlier, Ben Sasse has said he's called on impeachment. He said he would vote for impeachment if it comes before the Senate. So think about this. You had 49 votes for impeachment before. You have another Democrat who's been seated with Mark Kelly in Arizona. You add Sasse, you add Murkowski, you add Collins. I mean,
And is it worth the outrage that comes from the other side?
Yes, because if you're not going to impeach over this, and you can't impeach over anything, and I don't care how many days are left, like this is the breaking point. The message has to be sent. This cannot go on without a response. And even with if there was only 2 days left, the outcome of this would not only say, hey, he's been impeached twice, we're holding him accountable for his role in this, but also impeachment makes sure that he can't run for federal office ever again. He's done.
You're the Republicans and you want to end Trumpism right now, impeach his ass.
Yeah.
Let's pivot to talk about Trump and Trump's behavior and what he did on Wednesday. And we're going to use words like accountability and stuff like that drives me crazy. But
that doesn't exist in politics.
It doesn't exist. So Wednesday started with them bringing out the B team first. There was a bunch of lunatics in MAGA hats who was whipping the crowd. And these were some everyday citizens who were just spitting out the party lines, take it back, stop the steal, all that horseshit. Then we step up our game. First, Rudy came on. And Rudy's comments included an invitation for live combat. Rudy took it to an 11 in typical Rudy style. And then Don Jr. came on. I don't understand. I've never used narcotics, so I don't understand the whole, what they call the cocaine jaw, where you're constantly like, popping your jaw. If you've seen anything with Don Jr., you'll know what I'm talking about. So he rolls up, probably coke to the gills, and he ends with basically telling everybody that Trump is the Republican Party. There is no party without him. We need to fight for him. Don't be weak. Let's get this started. And then the president takes the stage and for 70 minutes whips the crowd with the rhetoric he's used for the past 2 years and the specific rhetoric about stealing elections, rigged elections that he's used since December 5th. And he ends it with telling them, you have to show strength. You have to fight. The problem with the Republican Party until I got here was they were a bunch of Romney weenies that just would not fight back. And we cannot let that happen. So join me on a march to the Capitol. He directs them to go to the Capitol. I think all of us would agree at a bare minimum, Trump bears responsibility and he was negligent in his rhetoric and created an atmosphere that allowed this to happen. I think nobody can disagree with that.
He created the narrative that motivated the Stop the Steal rally. So there's that. And then let's not forget that he said he was going to join them and he ditched them. He went back to the White House. He said he would join them for the rally. And then when this happens, he tweets out a very incendiary tweet, basically indicating that Pence has betrayed them and that Pence is doing what he should be doing, which puts Mike Pence's life in danger. And there were people who were targeting Pence. So his tweets continued to escalate the situation, culminating in the half-hearted tweet that was sent out, where he told the rioters to go home, but at the same time said he loved them, and then said this is what happens when an election is stolen, and completely justifying what happened, which I think shocked everybody.
That little video snippet was unreal because not only did he repeat the lie that the election was stolen, and not only did he say he loved them, but there was also a component. Oh shoot! I just lost my train of thought. We'll edit this part out because we edit our podcast. I'm trying to remember that video that I saw though, because I watched it before it got pulled.
Yeah, there was I love you. You're special, but you got to go home now.
And something to the fact, don't act like the other side. He said that, and then. But what struck me most was just the claim that, this is what happens when an election is stolen. I mean, for those words to come out of his mouth, this is what should be expected.
That video, Jason, remind me of you're in college and you're trying to get your drunk buddy into the car when he doesn't want to leave the bar. And you got to tell him, it's okay. You're special. It's okay. I understand. It was the complete opposite of that Sister Souljah moment we talked about, where somebody looks these people in the eye and says, you're wrong, and what you believe is wrong. Inside.
Didn't he repeat there's very bad people influencing this on the side, and that's why we needed to, there was a line about that, because it was a repeat of the Mexican border, and he tied it back to that about there's very bad people that we're going to have to fight on this, and I'm with you.
Yeah. From a legal definition, incitement is basically when I tell Brandon, go punch Jason in the face. That is wrong. That is illegal. It's just immoral if I say, I really don't like Jason, and I keep at it until Brandon attacks you. And I think that's the legal hair that we're splitting with why Trump is not going to be charged with incitement and why he is not going. There's basically going to be no accountability for his actions on that day moving forward, even when he's not president. The DOJ came out today and said nobody will be charged with anything, Giuliani, Don Jr., or the president, based on their actions on Wednesday.
Well, there's more than the actions on Wednesday, right? I mean, it's all the way back to December 19th when Trump was saying, big protest in D.C., be there, it'll be wild. The tone of it implying more than, a fun, raging party.
Yeah. And this gets to the point where people knew this was coming. This was a predictable outcome. Maybe not the storming of the Capitol by a group of rioters wearing horned helmets. I don't think anybody saw exactly this happen, but everybody had a strong suspicion that this could end very, very poorly. And I think that's what people are running away from today and trying to provide some cover to the president. Fox News and conservative media has been trying to kind of construct this safe spot where Trump can still operate in some way. And I don't know if that's going to be possible. Brandon, do you see Trump having any political career after January 20th?
No, I think that it's over. I mean, I want to, say that it's over, and I'm fairly confident of that, although that's why I would prefer impeachment to ensure that. But I think that this really was a turning point. And I think that's evident by the just strong level of condemnation across the board, the number of officials who are resigning, even though they're cowards and, they're doing this at the 11th hour. But I mean, you cannot, and again, the context, let's not forget, I mean, he would call in or make the call for allowing the DC National Guard to go in. Pence had to make that call because he would not. And aides have said that he was actually enjoying what was going on. He was watching this and he did not want it to stop. I mean, that's an insight into who he is and what type of person he is. So it is difficult to charge him with a crime because, like you said, you need to have direct evidence that all of this happened. And so, inaction is, not usually enough to charge somebody with a crime. But there is every indication that this is exactly what he wanted. And he was not dismayed by this at all. I mean, this went like he probably thought it would.
There's certainly accountability. And I believe that he needs to be impeached again simply because we have to send the message to the next person that occupies this seat. From here moving forward, there has to be accountability and consequences for those actions. That's kind of the high moral ground reason for impeaching him. The practical reason to impeaching him, last week, the Iranian government came out with a statement that they said, Donald Trump, there is no safe place on planet Earth for you. They made a not so veiled threat to the sitting president of the United States. In the past 3 days, we've flown multiple B-52 missions across Iran in the Middle East. My point being here is this guy who is obviously emotionally charged at best, mentally unstable at worst, who a terror nation has made a global threat against, is still capable of launching a military attack and is conducting military exercises during this 12 to 13 day period. I find that incredibly alarming.
It is. And let's not forget that even a couple of weeks ago, that he was wanting to launch an attack against Iran as a way of being able to deflect from, what was happening with the election. And he had to be talked out of it. So the problem is now, and his mental state, I mean, he still has 12 days left. There's so much damage, it could still be done. And that's the danger in allowing him to remain, because his fingers are in the nuclear codes.
Pelosi had a chat with the Defense Department about that, which
I heard about that earlier today. I do want to read back for those who weren't able to see them in real time because Twitter removed them. But as the carnage was happening, and he had an opportunity immediately to put a stop to this, his tweet instead was, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what we should have done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent ones. USA demands the truth!" ! He poured fuel on the fire. And then the tweet that got him banned was the one where he said, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and peace and remember this day forever." That is what the President of the United States said.
There were literally times on Wednesday where I could have put my head in my hands and shed a tear or two. When you just sat here, and it was when tweets like that came out, when it's like, I'm sitting here watching a group of insurrectionists charge the Capitol, and in real time, the president is basically cheering them on. I just never thought that's where this would go. I think what we should have done, Brandon, is we should have played last week's podcast for Cruz and Holly. The way to the Trump base is just to bribe him. It's real simple. Just pay for it. Just, tell him that $500 million he owes the Russians. Yeah, we'll just pay it for you. I mean, if you want Trump's base and you want Trump's support, the way to get there is through the grift. It's the easiest way. It's always the way. So we agree that Trump has no real political future after this. 2024 for him is out of reach. Right now, he is weapons grade plutonium. He is not to be touched. Can he rehabilitate himself? I don't think so.
You know what? I'll just give you I'll play the devil's advocate here. How many times did we see that guy on stage while he was campaigning 4 years ago and thought, there's no way he survives this. There's no way he survives this. There's no way he survives. Each news piece that would come out, each competitor he was up against, terrible things he would say, actions he would take, some unearthed video or audio from the past, nothing took that guy down. He was fun then. Are we naive to think he wouldn't be in the future?
Brandon, who is the first Republican running for re-election in the House that invites Trump to put on a rally for his re-election effort? Maybe, or maybe answer another way. How many? Because more than one will do it.
Oh, I mean, unfortunately, there's a good number out of the 121 who voted against certifying the election who would. There's so many Trumpian House Republicans. It's a little bit of a different place in the Senate, unfortunately. I would say, probably a couple dozen, at least 2 to 3 dozen.
I would think so.
That I could think of right off the back.
Yeah.
People like Louis Gohmert. I mean, there's plenty of others.
The last half of 2022 is going to be filled with nothing but Trump campaigning for the Louis Gohmerts of the world. Ugh. Well, guys, I think I'm about talked out here. We went a little bit longer as it warranted. This was part podcast, part therapy session. Again, Brandon, I can't believe Monday we sat here and just had a nice casual 1 hour thing. And now it's just like, how do we put the world back together?
At the end of that, your guys' worst case scenario was we'd be spending 3 or 4 days waiting for results from Georgia to come in.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, we'll talk some more about Georgia next week because that is fascinating what happened, and it's
also a testament to their election authorities. Again, Secretary of State, the election administrator under him for the state as well, who made himself available. Yeah. The fact that they were able to count all those ballots as quickly as they did, and they worked long shifts and they stayed working throughout the night to get it done.
Yeah. All right.
Talk about patriots.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's our hour. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks,
guys.
Thanks for listening to 2 Men in the Middle. Make sure to give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Check out our website at 2meninthemiddle.com. Drop us an email at 2meninthemiddle@gmail.com or tweet at us at 2 Men in the Middle. We'll see you next week.